If everyone can take a seat, we're going to start in just a few moments. There are plenty of seats towards the center, so please, if you could just move down or make way for others, well, I'm sure we'll fit everyone in. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to our Civil War Roundtable program tonight. The Union League Legacy Foundation is a nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Everything we do is based on that first line of the Union League bylaws. Every member shall support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. I'm so thrilled that we have such a great crowd tonight. Everything that we do is made possible through the generous contributions of members and others who share our values and want us to share them with so many more people. We have a wonderful crowd, of course, tonight. We have a great speaker, so I'm going to try to get out of the way as soon as I can. But before I do, a few logistics. The program will run about an hour in length. We will have questions at the end, and we will have them using microphones. Please use the microphone because we are streaming live and we cannot hear the questions without the microphone. And remember, keep your questions to 2 or 3 sentences. And if you can't end that 2 or 3 sentences with a question mark, you have failed. And Joe actually can turn you off too if he wants to. So if you would silence your cell phones, please. I'll take a moment and ask you to do that. We have some wonderful upcoming programs. For the first time in 2 years, we have an in-person Royal Oak program. November 1st, the Lamb House, which is the house of Henry James and B.F. Benson, is going to be a great program, November 1st. November 15th, we have Kenny Wu, who's going to be talking about his book, The Inconvenient Minority, The End of Meritocracy in the United States. I think that's going to be an interesting program. And on the 22nd of November, we have a program on the Supreme Court with Robbie George from Princeton, one of Professor Guelzo's colleagues, Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center, and Judge Prater. That'll be a great program as well. And now it's my great pleasure. I mentioned that we only exist because of your generous contributions. The guys in charge of all that is the chair of our development committee, Union League member, all around good guy. Allow me to introduce Dr. Gary Dersheimer, who will introduce our program. Gary.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be with you tonight and to serve our Legacy Foundation, an organization I know you share my appreciation for as the chair of the Development Committee. It's an even greater privilege for me to have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, my fellow league member, Professor Alan Guelzo. He's the only 3-time winner of the prestigious National Lincoln Prize. Professor Guelzo has spoken countless times at the Union League. In 2013, he was awarded the Union League's prestigious Lincoln Award. As of today, he is the only Union League member to receive our Lincoln Award. The author of numerous books, Professor Guelzo's most recent work, Robert E. Lee, A Life, was published last month by Croft and has received critical acclaim. In the words of George Will, Alan C. Guelzo has written exactly what the nation urgently needs right now, an example of mature thinking about complex, flawed people who took difficult decisions in context not of their making or choosing. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Join me in welcoming Professor Alan Guelzo.
It is once again a pleasure to find myself speaking on a Union League platform. And I want to especially thank John Miko and Jim Mundy and all the staff of the Legacy Foundation for making this evening possible. And thank you all for coming out and expressing your interest and curiosity in this very peculiar individual, Robert Edward Lee, made all the more peculiar by the fact that we're talking about him tonight in the Grant Room. No one ever seemed to doubt that Robert E. Lee was a great man. What was less obvious was exactly what they meant by great. For Francis Charles Lawley, the London Times correspondent in America during the Civil War, Lee was the perfect ideal of calmness amid chaos. Watching Lee through the Fredericksburg battle, Lawley could not restrain himself from writing in commendation of the serenity, or if I may so express it, the unconscious dignity of General Lee's courage when he is under fire. For Garnet Wolseley, who in subsequent years would emerge as Britain's most famous general, it was Lee's courtesy and gentility, or as he put it, the greatness of Robert E. Lee in the sense in which he resembled a splendid specimen of an English gentleman that made Robert E. Lee great. And for yet others, Lee's greatness was in his embodiment of patriotism and duty as a loyal, a confident, a hopeful American, and one of the very greatest, according to Gamaliel Bradford in 1912, and a model that future Americans may study with profit as long as there is an America. In the glow of such reverence, it seems irrelevant, almost impertinent, to inquire about Lee's qualities as a general. That Lee held off the Northern armies for almost 4 years appears as an accomplishment that speaks for itself. And the victories he engineered on the peninsula, at Second Bull Run, and at Fredericksburg in 1862, at Chancellorsville in 1863, and even the stubborn delaying actions he fought against Ulysses Grant during the Overland Campaign of 1864, all seem to wear the appearance of some superior military mind at work. And yet, estimates of Robert E. Lee's skills as a great general have drifted, then and now, towards vagueness. And few, even among the reverent, have seriously probed Lee's handling of the three principal responsibilities of great commanders, which are the strategic, the tactical, and the logistical. In other words, the large-scale picture of strategy, the immediate on-the-battleground encounters of tactics, and the direction of supply and movement, which constitutes logistics and operations. Now, partly, this lack of attention is because Lee's biographers have rarely been military analysts. His greatest memoirist, Douglas Southall Freeman, was a journalist. His severest critic, Thomas Connolly, was an academic historian. But partly, the reason why questions like this have not been asked have been that, quite frankly, military analysts have had other things to do. For half a century after Lee's death, the U.S. Army cultivated little in the way of strategic thinking and military analysis because, protected by two oceans, the United States scarcely needed to do much in the way of military analysis. Whoever can command his company well, declared William Tecumseh Sherman in 1880, can equally well command a regiment, a brigade, division, or grand army. As easy as that. By the time serious military analysis had become an accepted professional task in the 20th century, military affairs had moved far beyond the place where Robert E. Lee could yield worthwhile insights. Which leaves us with this question largely unanswered. If Robert E. Lee was indeed the gray genius of the Confederacy, what was it that made him a genius? If he was a genius at all. Lee became the quarry of biographers even before his death, but hardly any of them were interested in his military philosophy. A Richmond journalist, James Dabney McCabe, published a worshipful 717-page biography, longer even than mine, entitled Life and Campaigns of Robert E. Lee in 1866, in which he lauded Lee as the Christian soldier who, having been charged with the fate of a nation, never failed in his duty, but was faithful to the end. But McCabe's opinions of Lee's campaigns amounted to little more than bromides, hailing a genius second to none in the world. John Eston Cook, who had served in the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee, did not offer anything more specific in his Life of General Robert E. Lee, published the year after Lee's death in 1871. Cook's Lee is among the greatest soldiers of history, but mostly as the noblest illustration of dignity and moderation. Any explanation of Lee, the strategist or tactician, was swallowed up in Cook's admiration for Lee's character, which was great in adversity. It was that character which became the overriding theme of one Lee biography after another in the 19th century. Edward Lee Child, the general's Parisian-born nephew, touched only briefly on Lee as a model of military skillfulness and a military genius. He preferred to dwell on Lee as possessing a paternal sweetness, which his soldiers recognized amid the tiresomeness of the march and in the tumult of the battle as they cried aloud, "There is Uncle Robert." Those moments where Lee's military abilities seemed to falter, as at Gettysburg, were swiftly excused by the paladins of the lost cause, by Jubal Early, J. William Jones, the Southern Historical Society papers. Those mistakes were the faults of Lee's subordinates. And the final triumph of Ulysses Grant at Appomattox was explained in echoes of Lee's final communication to the Army of Northern Virginia, General Orders Number 9, by the simple attrition that Grant's superior numbers afforded him. It was really not until Fitzhugh Lee, another of Lee's nephews, issued General Lee in 1895, that any deliberate attempt was made at evaluating Lee as a soldier. And even then, the effort was brief. And Fitzhugh Lee's judgments were halting and tentative. Lee affirmed that his Uncle Robert stands in the front rank of the warriors of the world, but only in the world of 1865. The great improvements in firearms have changed the tactics of the battlefield, Fitzhugh Lee admitted, which suggested that any tactical wisdom his uncle had to impart was now obsolete. There was more to be said about the general as a strategist, but Fitzhugh Lee meant by that merely that his uncle had the swift intuition to discern the purpose of his opponent and the power of rapid combination to oppose to it prompt resistance, which does not tell us very much. Even as late as John Joseph Bowen's The Strategy of Robert E. Lee in 1914, it was still possible to describe Lee's military prowess as well-nigh miraculous, while at the same time leaving miraculous to dangle as a metaphor. At best, Bowen defined that miracle as the foresight to oppose with superior forces an enemy at every point of decisive importance. That this miraculous ability ended up losing the Civil War did not diminish Lee's grandeur for Bowen, because even genius itself is not proof against main strength or awkwardness, or the perfidy of unreliable lieutenants, in particular, James Longstreet.
The new weaponry, the administrative expansion, and above all, the carnage of the First World War produced some very different and much more querulous views of Lee's military abilities, beginning with British General Sir Frederick Morris's Robert E. Lee the Soldier in 1925. Morris paid due homage to Lee for his management of the peninsula as supreme in conception, and of the Overland Campaign as 50 years ahead of the time. But Morris also rated Lee poorly in his staff management, found him tempted too often to rashness and guilty of serious overreach at Gettysburg. Another British general, the eccentric J.F.C. Fuller, was even more critical in his 1933 book, Grant and Lee, dismissing Lee outright as one of the most incapable generals-in-chief in history. Fuller's acolyte, Basil Henry Little Hart, in his mid-century Strategy, not only gave Lee short shrift in his analysis of the Civil War, but announced that Lee and Jackson were responsible for a gigantic strategic error by devoting a disproportionate attention to the eastern theater of the war, since, according to Little Hart, it was in the West that the decisive blows were struck. Fuller and Little Hart thus set the stage for a deep reevaluation of both Lee and his campaigns, culminating in 1977 in Thomas L. Connolly's The Marble Man, Robert E. Lee and His Image in American Society. Connolly had emerged in the 1960s as the premier historian of the Confederacy's Western Army, the Army of Tennessee. And he bitterly resented the flippancy with which Civil War historians dismissed both the Army of Tennessee and the Confederate West. Too many Southerners, he complained, saw things through Lee's eyes only and considered the hills around Gettysburg more important than those at Perryville or Chickamauga. In 1969, Connolly aimed an attack at Lee in the scholarly quarterly Civil War History, questioning whether Lee possessed a sufficiently broad military mind to deal with overall Confederate matters, and wondering whether the South might not have fared better had it possessed no Robert E. Lee. 8 years later, when Connolly published The Marble Man, his skepticism about Lee as a general had blossomed into a full-fledged offensive, not only against the Lee image, but against what Connolly called the Virginia pattern or Virginia syndrome, which used Lee to promote the ultimate proof of the superiority of Southern life and Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Connolly's Lee now became an anti-hero, with Connolly creating what one historian called a victimhood narrative of the war, in which now neglected Western soldiers were presented as the real protagonists of the Civil War. Once a rupture that vehement had been introduced into the Lee literature, it proved impossible to stanch the ebbing of Lee's reputation. Even so, that ebbing was increasingly borne along by attacks on Lee's character, on his less than enlightened views on race, rather than on his military shortcomings. Two strenuously critical evaluations of Lee that followed in Connolly's footsteps: Alan Nolan's Lee Considered, General Robert E. Lee and Civil War History in 1991, and Michael Fellman's The Making of Robert E. Lee in 2000, were more distressed by Lee's belief in the inferiority of Blacks as a race and his negative view of the white lower classes than by his battlefield failures. Even Emory Thomas's more even-tempered view of Lee in Robert E. Lee, a Biography in 1995, had less to say about Lee as a strategist, a tactician, or logistician, and more about Lee as a tragic hero who experienced ample sorrow and catastrophic loss during his life, and who sought nobly, but unsuccessfully, to escape the restraints put upon him by his family and his region. So we have, in effect, returned to the character studies of the 19th century, rather than analyzing Robert E. Lee for the one thing which has made him worth studying at all, his military conduct between 1861 and 1865. If there is a word which should be used more often about Robert E. Lee as a military commander, that word is surprising. The United States Army that Lee entered as a brevet second lieutenant was little more than a frontier constabulary, with no mounted contingent until the 1830s, and only artillery, infantry, and engineers as its branches. Until at least the 1850s, only 2 of the Army's 53 posts had garrisons larger than 500 men. The engineers considered themselves the technocratic elite of the Army. And no wonder, since the Corps of Engineers managed West Point and structured its curriculum to copy the engineering studies that prevailed at France's École Polytechnique. But the Corps of Engineers was actually less a corps and more like a platoon. It numbered, on average, only 24 commissioned officers, and it had no enlisted contingent until 1846. Lee's graduation from West Point in 1829 as second in his class, and who remembers that Charles Mason was first? That second place graduation guaranteed him a commission in the Corps of Engineers, but that also guaranteed that Lee's Army service would be largely confined to a series of coastal engineering projects, building third system fortifications like Fort Pulaski and Fort Carroll, managing maintenance at Fort Monroe and Fort Hamilton, and overseeing the restoration of the St. Louis waterfront. The bright aspect of Lee's engineering service was that he missed the nightmare of the Army's entanglement in the Trail of Tears, as well as the risks of active duty under fire in the miasma of the Seminole Wars. The duller aspect was the sclerosis of promotion in the engineers. After nearly 20 years' service, Lee was still only a captain. And at that 20-year mark, we find him begging the chief engineer, Joseph Gilbert Totten, for a transfer to another branch in the event of the outbreak of war. The war he wanted conveniently broke out with Mexico in 1846, and Lee was duly dispatched to serve as an engineering officer on the staff, first of John Wool and then Winfield Scott. Although Winfield Scott is, unfairly, best known for his unbounded vanity and for his nickname, Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott was beyond question the finest American general officer of the 19th century. And his lightning campaign to capture Mexico City in 1847 was the proof. He also had a sharp eye for military talent, and he quickly adopted Lee as his chief aide, sending Lee on one key reconnaissance mission after another. This won Lee 3 brevets, honorary promotions, but not real promotions. But at least it won him the praise from Scott that Scott's success was largely due to the skill, valor, and undaunted energy of Robert E. Lee. Lee learned lessons from Winfield Scott that had never been touched upon at West Point. First of all, Scott's campaign to Mexico City set an example of the continuous offensive. even if the numbers were unfavorable. Whatever offensives, cost, and casualties, they made up in keeping the initiative firmly in one's own hands. Second, Scott's campaign gave a clear preference for the services of West Point regulars, trusting them with wide discretion in executing orders and keeping the volunteers and the amateurs on a short leash. Third, Lee learned to draw a bright line between army affairs and politics. Venturing over that line nearly destroyed Winfield Scott. And Lee would exhibit an almost phobic unwillingness thereafter to challenge politicians. All of these things would become hallmarks of Lee's generalship a decade and a half later. Yet learning these lessons did not translate into using them. The end of the Mexican War sent Lee back to coastal engineering projects from 1848 to 1852, and then to a brief and boring stint as superintendent at West Point until 1855. Finally, when Congress authorized the creation of 2 regiments of light cavalry to police the frontiers of the newly acquired territories from Mexico, Lee was tagged as lieutenant colonel of the new 2nd Cavalry. But even then, he spent most of his ensuing 5 years chasing bands of Comanche and disgruntled Mexicans across the Texas plains and the Rio Grande. It was not, actually, until October of 1859, when John Brown launched his harebrained insurrection at Harper's Ferry, that Lee was actually called upon to command troops under fire. And that was only because he happened to be on leave from Texas, and his command amounted to exactly 2 companies of Marines. Looked at coldly, Lee ought to have been no one's first choice as a great field general. What made the difference to the Confederate authorities who recruited him for their service in 1861 were the glowing endorsements of Winfield Scott and the backing of Jefferson Davis, who had been Secretary of War while Lee was superintendent at West Point. Even so, Lee's first assignments were far from stellar. He struggled to restrain Virginia's secessionists from provoking a Union invasion of Virginia, and did not succeed. And he failed to push back a Union advance into Western Virginia in the fall of 1861. Only the incapacitation of Joseph Johnston at the helm of the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862 allowed Jefferson Davis to shove Lee into command in order to save the Confederate capital at Richmond from capture. But from there, Lee went nowhere but up. His lessons from Mexico now paid their dividends. Lee rebuffed any notion of abandoning Richmond to the encircling forces of George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. And when he was warned about McClellan's superior numbers, he erupted, "Stop, stop. If you go to ciphering, we are whipped beforehand." Rather than retreating, the word now leaped down the chain of command that General Lee expressed the determination to try and wipe the enemy out when he again meets them, which he very nearly did in a 7 days battle that copied perfectly the principles of continuous offensive. And rather than rest on those laurels, Lee almost at once bounded northwards, defeating another Union army at Second Bull Run and lunging across the Potomac, headed for Pennsylvania. Taking the war north, Lee argued, would change the character of the war. Indeed, it would. Jefferson Davis had spent much of the first year of the Civil War resting in the confidence that a show of force all along the Confederacy's northern borders would be all that would be needed to dissuade the northern people from supporting the war. The disasters that befell the Confederacy in the early spring of 1862 destroyed that confidence, but without replacing it with any corresponding energy in the South's response. Too many Southerners now predicted that it was perfectly sensible to decoy the enemy into the interior and then to cut them off, as were Braddock and Burgoyne and Cornwallis and Ross and Pakenham and our own troops in the Everglades of Florida. Lee understood this as an invitation to strategic surrender. General Lee's views of the real nature and object of the war on the part of the Southern people, wrote his staffer, Charles Marshall, convinced Lee that it was a capital error to count upon contingencies as the means of success. To secure its independence, the Confederacy would have to strike as quickly and as hard as it could, catching the Northern behemoth in the early rounds of the fight and scoring a surprise knockout before the North's full strength could be brought to bear. Lee was conscious that if the war were to continue much longer on such a scale of magnitude, the South must fail from exhaustion, Marshall recalled. It therefore became important to consider how to accomplish quickly the greatest possible results with the smallest loss. The place to do that would be on Northern soil, as far north of the Potomac as possible. Nothing endeared to Lee the unlikely figure of Stonewall Jackson so much as Jackson's advice to transfer this campaign from the banks of the James to those of the Susquehanna. Hence, once Lee had notched his victory at Second Bull Run, he moved north into Maryland and toward Pennsylvania. The midterm congressional elections in the North were only 2 months away, with other state elections scheduled even sooner. If he fought no battle, the prospect of a Confederate army operating unhindered on Northern soil might overthrow Lincoln's majorities in the federal Congress and force a peace. The famous intelligence blunder that allowed Lee's campaign orders, Special Order Number 191, to slip into McClellan's hands, cut that movement short. And though Lee afterwards won back-to-back defensive victories in Virginia over the Army of the Potomac, at Fredericksburg in December, and Chancellorsville in May, Lee saw no real value in them. At Fredericksburg, we gained a battle, inflicting very severe loss on the enemy in men and material, Lee wrote to one of Jefferson Davis's aides. But while our people were greatly elated, I was much depressed. The truth was that we had really accomplished nothing. We had not gained a foot of ground, and I knew the enemy could easily replace the men he had lost. And the loss of material was, if anything, rather beneficial to him, as it gave an opportunity to contractors to make money. Lee was determined to return to his invasion plan in 1863. If the state of Pennsylvania were invaded, and the capital of the Commonwealth occupied, and a great victory gained upon her soil, the sentiment of the Northern people might turn in favor of peace and result in the recognition of Southern independence. At Gettysburg, those hopes were again crushed. But as one Union participant at Gettysburg admitted, if Lee had succeeded there, our army would have been cut in two, and in a few days, the rebels would have occupied Harrisburg and Philadelphia, and what would have become of the Union League then? And terms of peace would have been dictated by General Lee in Philadelphia or New York. Even after the Gettysburg defeat, Lee still contemplated another move northwards in 1864, until Ulysses Grant's overland campaign intervened. Watching Lee unfold these large-scale plans frames him predominantly as a strategic thinker, shrewdly determining what blow delivered where would have the maximum effect in bringing success to the Confederacy. This places him at a far remove from the parochial, wall-eyed Virginian portrayed by Thomas Connolly. Since Lee understood that such blows could only be effectively struck in the East, in Maryland, and in Pennsylvania, where the failure of public support for the Lincoln administration would certainly doom Lincoln's prosecution of the war. That Lee came close to accomplishing such results, and on 2 occasions, is remarkable in itself. That it took until Lincoln's re-election in November 1864 before that possibility finally evaporated is even more remarkable. Keep this contrast in view. In 1864, less than 6 months were required for Prussian and Austrian forces to overrun Denmark's fabled fortification lines of Dibble and pry loose the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein. 2 years later, the Prussians and Italians needed only 6 weeks to force the Austrian Empire to negotiations. And 4 years on, Prussia and the German states took less than a year to humble the French Second Empire, including a 5-month-long siege of Paris, and annex the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. When Lee is stood beside the witless French marshals, François Bazin and Patrice de Marmont, or beside the fumbling but well-intentioned Austrian Ludwig von Benedek, Lee rises to Napoleonic proportions. But if it is easy to delineate Lee's strategic perceptiveness, it's more difficult to assess Lee's tactical and managerial skills. Lee's strategic grasp was so intuitive that it seemed almost necessarily to follow that he should also possess an equivalent tactical intelligence. He is indeed a very great soldier, marveled one awed northern observer. As a tactician on the field of battle, he has no equals in this war. The ease with which he seems to handle his troops and the judgment he shows in throwing them in is admirable. And the Britisher, Garnet Wolseley, years afterward believed that not only were Lee's combinations to secure victory the conceptions of a truly great strategist, but when they had been effected, his tactics were then almost everything that could be desired up to the moment of victory. Even so, it is possible at least to raise an eyebrow about Lee's tactical abilities, if only because Lee himself sets so little value as a commanding general on tactical oversight. Lee was not exaggerating when he told the Prussian military observer, Justus Scheibert, that he preferred to leave tactical details on the battlefield to his subordinates, trying to avoid total Napoleonic control. Lee said that he would plan and work with all my might to bring the troops to the right place and at the right time, but from that moment, it is my general's turn to perform their duty. That worked well when he has subordinates equal to such responsibilities, especially Stonewall Jackson. Too often, however, Lee was forced to reach for tactical control himself, and his distaste for doing so showed in his management of Gettysburg and the Wilderness. Lee at Fredericksburg might have seemed to Charles Francis Lawley to be the epitome of battlefield serenity, but he could afford serenity at Fredericksburg because he had Longstreet and Jackson to carry out the tactical plans. All of that would change a year and a half later when both Jackson and Longstreet were gone. At the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, he had to abandon serenity to take immediate tactical charge, and the results were not always shining. If Lee had a tactical trademark at all, it was a weakness for repetition. If a particular battlefield maneuver worked once, as with Longstreet's crushing flank attack at Second Bull Run, Lee would propose it again and again, as at Chancellorsville, as at the second day at Gettysburg, as at the first day in the Wilderness. Even Pickett's charge was technically a repetition of Longstreet's flank attack the day before. And Lee would keep that up until it was apparent that a particular tactic had outlived its usefulness. The last two offensive operations he supervised at Fort Stedman and at Appomattox abandoned any effort at turning flanks in favor of head-on assaults. There was another weakness too, and that weakness involved the protection of pets, not parakeets and puppies, but military pets like Ambrose Powell Hill and William Pendleton and his bland chief of staff, Robert Chilton. Even Walter Taylor, who shared the principal staff duties with Charles Marshall, agreed that Lee was too careful of the personal feelings of his subordinate commanders and continued in command those whose fitness for their position he was not convinced of. Or what was more to the point, Lee was too protective of West Pointers. What Lee would have made of untutored Confederate leaders like Nathan Bedford Forrest or Pat Claiborne is beyond estimation. There are lesser marks to be given too for Lee's grasp of logistics, which was connected to his abhorrence of intrusions in politics and by politicians. The fatal under-resourcing of the Army of Northern Virginia was a source of incessant lamentation from Lee during the war, and the cramped dimensions of his staff, as dictated by the Confederate Congress, repeatedly handicapped his oversight of the Army of Northern Virginia, and probably produced its most disastrous mishap, the lost orders of the Maryland campaign. What is curious is how little Lee tried to force on Jefferson Davis the administrative changes necessary to correct many of these shortfalls, starting with the Army of Northern Virginia's supply deficiencies. He took to the Richmond newspapers to plead for the production of subsistence by the farmers, but he made no demands for the replacement of the incompetents who ran the Confederate quartermaster and commissary departments. As he told John Brown Gordon, he was a soldier, and it was his province to obey the orders of the government and to advise or counsel with the civil authorities only upon questions directly affecting his army and its defense of the capital and the country. If there is glory to be found in Lee as a general, it is to be found in Lee, the strategist, more than the tactician, and certainly more than Lee, the operational manager. Ironically, Lee might have found even that evaluation too rosy. In the final years of his life, as president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, Lee showed little enthusiasm for military matters. When he was sent a copy of Edward Bruce Hamley's The Operations of War Explained and Illustrated, Lee set it aside. The subject is one in which I have had some experience, he coldly observed, and hope never again to have to the need of recurring to, and therefore have never read the book. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, Lee regretted that the French and the Germans did not submit their differences to the arbitration of the other powers. It would have been a grand moral victory over the passions of men and would have so elevated the contestants in the eyes of the present and future generations as to have produced a beneficial effect. But that, he added despairingly, might have been expecting too much from the present standard of civilization. And I fear we are destined to kill and slaughter each other for ages to come. He staggered one student at Washington College when he told him that the great mistake of my life was taking a military education. Always balancing any acknowledgement of Lee's military accomplishments is the overriding fact of Lee's military crime, which is not a word I use idly. Much of the recent attention to Lee has focused on the backwardness of his views on slavery and race. What often seems to disappear from view is a defect which unsympathetic contemporaries complained was a far greater offense. And that was treason, which is the greatest crime a soldier can commit. And despite all the qualifications and denials which have been entered on this point since 1865, no one seems to conform more plainly to the constitutional definition of treason against the United States, which is levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, than Robert E. Lee. Yet this objection hardly ever enters into a discussion of Lee's stature as a soldier. One reason is because in the modern cosmopolitan atmosphere of globalization, the notion of treason itself has acquired a kind of antique feel, like transportation to the antipodes, as if modern individuals should no longer be held to the standard of absolute loyalty to a single political entity. In our times, a motto like that of the Union League, love of country leads, seems almost old-fashioned. Hence, the one unarguable military crime of Robert E. Lee, the one which caused measurable death and destruction, and not just modern-day political discomfort, is the one which it has become less and less possible to understand as a crime. But the refusal to factor Lee's treason into any equation that measures his accomplishments as a soldier literally means a refusal to believe that communities can suffer betrayal to the point where their very existence is jeopardized. The first loyalty of an American soldier is not to a profession, not to a uniform, not to a leader, but to the nation. And the soldier's oath is one which swears to defend the Constitution against precisely those enemies, foreign and domestic, who are the solicitors of treasonous betrayal. To wave away consideration of Lee's action in raising his hand against the nation and the Constitution is to put into jeopardy the insurance that the American nation and the Constitution offer against the kinds of incessant, dynastic, ethnic, and religious wars which used to be the common lot of the human race. But perhaps the reluctance to pin on Robert E. Lee the crime of treason has a different root. Maybe not indifference, but malice toward none. Perhaps it is a token of an instinct running back to the Constitution's surprisingly narrow definition of treason, to err on the side of absorbing society's defaulters rather than marching them to the scaffold. Even in Lee's lifetime, Wendell Phillips, the prince of no-compromise abolitionism and an ardent advocate for post-war racial egalitarianism, acknowledged that we cannot hang men in regiments or cover the continent with gibbets. We cannot sicken the 19th century with such a sight. The best that Wendell Phillips could hope in Lee's case was to banish Lee with the rest. Amidst the chaos of an even more hideous war, begun by even more hideous dreamers, Winston Churchill acknowledged, with a decent reluctance, the genius of Erwin Rommel. We have, Churchill said in the House of Commons, we have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and, may I say, across the havoc of war, a great general. We could do much worse than to say the same of Robert Edward Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Guelzo. Wonderful. We have time for a few questions. Jim, question right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful speech. I have a question. I've heard an anecdote told about Robert Lee after the war when he was in Lexington. The story goes that he would often come into Richmond at St. Paul's for Sunday services. And a black gentleman got up in time for
For communion, coming to the rail.
Yes, thank you. And you can tell I don't really know that stuff. And that a black gentleman came up first, and the rector kind of looked horrified, not knowing what to do. And the story goes that Lee, who sat in the front, immediately stood up, knelt down next to the gentleman, and said to the rector, "Continue, please." And he did serve the Eucharist to the black gentleman and Lee. I have not been able to confirm that story. Have you ever heard it? Is it true?
I have heard it. You will not be able to confirm it, because in all likelihood, it is not true. This story was first told in 1903. All right, so we're long past any kind of immediate context. We're a good 40 years or so beyond the time when the event is supposed to have happened. It was described by Colonel Thomas Brown, who curiously was the same officer who sold Lee his famous horse, Traveler. And Colonel Brown wrote in the Richmond Times-Dispatch a description of this event, as you have very ably, very accurately depicted it. It was then repeated and published again in the magazine Confederate Veteran the following year. And after that has taken on something of a life of its own. It has appeared in many books about Lee, most principally in Charles Braceland Flood's Lee, The Last Years. But the first difficulty is, as I say, that the first record of this is in 1903. So we're long after the events. And how much credibility can we give to a reminiscence that is that far removed from the immediate context of the event? The second thing is, there's no confirmation of this from any other source. No one else ever stepped forward and said, yes, this happened. The rector of St. Paul's, Reverend Minigerode, in his memoirs makes no allusion to this, which is surprising. It would have been quite a dramatic incident, but Minigerode makes no reference to it. And above all, there's no description of anything like this in the contemporary Richmond newspapers. And so on that basis, one has to mark it down rather severely. If not perhaps an outright F, then maybe a D-. This is part of the job of the historian, to take material and to evaluate, to judge. Is what is being described here what really happened? Is it even close to what really happened? And some of the markers that you have to use as a historian is, how close is this to the actual event? In other words, was it observed? Are there other witnesses? And then you need to ask, are there other written records pertinent to it? This makes a historian sometimes sound like a lawyer. That is not always a bad thing, but it does mean we have to investigate and interrogate. And interrogating this story, the conclusion I've come to is to tell that story in Robert E. Lee, A Life, but to put it in a footnote at the back of the book, expressing my skepticism about it.
Kira.
It has been said that Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army. Please comment.
Very good, David.
Lincoln did not offer directly
personally command of the federal field armies to Lee. What he did was to employ an intermediary, the political expert and old Washington hand, Francis Preston Blair, on whom Lincoln was leaning heavily in the early weeks of his administration. Blair called Lee to a meeting at the home of Blair's son, Montgomery Blair, on Pennsylvania Avenue. Yes, that's right, that's Blair House. Francis Preston Blair sits Lee down and makes the offer, and Lee refuses. Lee offers as his basic reason, he cannot draw his sword against his native state, Virginia. Lee makes it clear he's not doing this as a defense of slavery. Lee tells Francis Preston Blair that if it was within his power, he'd free every slave in the South rather than see secession take place. His issue is Virginia, which in Lee's case really translates into not so much the physical soil of Virginia, it's the vast skein of family and relatives that Lee has in Virginia. But yes, the offer was made, not directly or personally by Abraham Lincoln, but using Francis Preston Blair as the intermediary. And on that, there are multiple witnesses and multiple accounts.
Jim, question over here. What effect did his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, have on young Lee?
All bad. Light Horse Harry Lee was one of the great heroes of the Revolution, and he was Robert's father. The problem was being a great successful cavalry commander under George Washington did not necessarily translate into success in civilian life, and it didn't. Light Horse Harry Lee embarked on a career of investments in Western real estate, all of which failed horribly. He burned through the cash belonging to his first wife, Matilda. When she died, he remarried a Virginia Carter and burned through her cash. If Light Horse Harry Lee was alive today, he would be investing in ski resorts in Bangladesh. Eventually, he winds up in debtor's prison. And then, to compound his economic blunders, gets himself involved in a political mob in Baltimore, is beaten almost within an inch of his life. And after that, decides that it's time to go someplace else. He leaves. He departs for the West Indies. And Robert never sees him again. Robert Lee is 6 years old when his father subtracts himself from his life. And it's significant for the trauma that that inflicts on Robert Lee that for some 50 years afterwards, in all of Lee's voluminous correspondence, only one letter ever makes a reference to his father. And that's his application letter to West Point. Apart from that, Light Horse Harry Lee is demonstrably absent. It is not until Robert Lee comes into his own in 1861 and 1862 that he finally really comes to terms with the legacy of his father and what his father meant to him or could have meant to him. Because it's not until then that he actually starts to talk about his father, that he visits his father's grave for the first time. And then at the end of his life in 1870, publishes a biographical memoir of his father in a reprint of his father's history of the Southern campaigns of the Revolution. So in time, Robert Lee does come to terms with the legacy of Light Horse Harry, but it's a difficult struggle because of all the human hurts that can be inflicted on children, there's really none that's more damaging than the loss of a parent before the beginning of adolescence. And I think the damage, I think the trauma of that in the life of Robert E. Lee plays a very large role in making the man who he was. But there's more of that in detail in Robert E. Lee, A Life.
We have time for one more question. Carrie, you have a question.
Thank you, Professor, for a very compelling presentation and a book which I am looking forward to enjoying. I am a proud graduate of Washington and Lee University, the college that Robert E. Lee was president of after the Civil War. Would you mind touching on that experience, how he came to be president and the transformation he had on the school, and possibly the honor code, which lives to this day?
At the end of the Civil War, what is Robert E. Lee? He's a defeated general. Worse than that, he is an indicted traitor. There has been a federal indictment of treason against Robert E. Lee. He never comes to trial because there's a number of complications that interfere with that. And eventually on Christmas Day, 1868, he's covered in a blanket amnesty issued by President Andrew Johnson. But for a large part of the time before that, there's always this sword hanging over his head. So he has to ask himself, what am I going to do? Especially, what is there I can do that will get me as far away from Washington, D.C. as I can get without violating the terms of the parole given by Ulysses Grant at Appomattox? The invitation comes to him from Washington College in the upper reaches of the Shenandoah. This is a very strange invitation because, for one thing, Washington College was almost dead. The Civil War just about killed it. It had 12 students. It had no money in the till. The idea that it was going to survive was something else. The trustees, in fact, were so hard up that the trustee whom they designate to go carry the invitation to Lee, they have to pass the hat so he can buy a new suit. That's how hard things are. And yet Lee accepts. Despite the fact that he had had a terrible time as superintendent at West Point, disliked it all, never saw himself as being any kind of educational leader, but he accepts the job. He goes to Lexington. And at that point, everyone is congratulating the trustees at Washington College. You have acquired a great figurehead. His name will look great on the letterhead. He makes them the figureheads. Robert E. Lee takes over Washington College. He restructures its curriculum. He recruits the student body to over 400 students. He builds an endowment to $250,000. That's a lot of moolah in 1865 to 66. Now, what's more, he gets it from Northerners. Robert E. Lee is immensely successful at shaking apples out of the trees. As president of Washington College, he actually is more successful than almost any other thing he attempts in his life. And I think it can be said in real terms that the 5 years that he spends as president of Washington College until his death in 1870 are really the happiest years of his life, because he is then able to call all the shots he wants to call. I mean, who on the board of trustees was going to disagree with General Lee? But even more, you mentioned the code of honor. Lee would interview every new student who arrived at Washington College, and he would tell them, we do not have a rule book here. We do not have a student code. The only thing that is required is that every student should behave himself as a gentleman. Now, everyone looks at that and says, oh my goodness, isn't that generous? Isn't that open-handed of Robert E. Lee? No, it isn't. Because what that means is that Robert E. Lee is the judge, jury, and executioner of what constitutes a gentleman. And that meant that all of the control over student affairs is concentrated in his hands, which is just where he wanted it. Those 5 years that he spends before his death really are remarkable years in building Washington College. And it's acknowledged by the fact that almost immediately after his death, the trustees vote to change the name of the institution to Washington and Lee, because they recognize that while George Washington was important to the founding of the place, he gave the original gift that would endow the college. It's Robert E. Lee who is its re-founder, because it would not probably, in all likelihood, have survived without the presidency of Robert E. Lee.
Alan, thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
Professor Guelzo, thank you. We will see everyone back November 1st, our first Royal Oak in almost 2 years. November 1st. Thank you.